The urge to start this video by saying, this summer has gone by so quickly. But it truly did. Hi, if you have made it to this tiny corner of YouTube, welcome, I'm happy to have you here. My name is Andi. I would say I'm a chaotic reader, and I presume you clicked on this video because you want to hear about all the books I read this summer. It's gonna be long, so feel free to put it on as a background sound while you do something else. That's how I usually watch these reading wrap-ups. I finished 11 books this summer and DNF'd a couple more, and this amount was only possible because I quit my full-time job earlier this year and I'm still searching for my next position while also taking German classes because I live in Vienna, Austria. So obviously I had a lot more free time to read than usual. Not that much free time, to be honest with you. This summer was a flurry of bachelorettes parties, weddings and family trips, but I could still find some peaceful moments for reading. Starting strong, I finally picked up Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Faeries in June. This book is well known for fans of cozy fantasy and Howl's Moving Castle, and these are the 2 points I would like to discuss first. It was very interesting to me when I tried to search for definitions of cozy fantasy online. There are multiple angles to approach it basically. Some define it as a book that features a small, close-knit community, often in a rural or small town setting, and a focus on the characters and their relationships rather than epic battles and world-saving quests. Others say it is a term within the subgenre of fantasy to describe works that contain or portray a comforting, healing narrative or story, and they center around slice-of-life moments and they are often gentle in their storytelling. In Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Faeries, we have a small town setting because the main narrator, Emily, moves to this rural village to gather information for her research on Fae folklore, later joined by her fellow professor, the insufferable Vandal Bumblebee. We get the story in a diary format, and that also contains academic citations when talking about the fairy folklore, and I think that added to the overall coziness of the story. However, based on the cozy fantasy genre, I wasn't expecting how dark and creepy the Fae in this world would be. They resemble more the classic folklore tales of tricksters kidnapping children and playing with their minds, and it's emphasized in the book that one needs to be clever not to fall prey to their games. There are no epic battles or world-saving quests or heroes in this story, but there is a generous amount of eerie creatures, so be prepared for that. The second point is the comparison with Howl's Moving Castle, and the strongest I could see it is with Vandal Bumblebee's character, who begins supporting Emily's research while also hiding his own secrets. I literally made this note while reading, saying Bumblebee is a lot like Howl, just a bit more charming and capable, and I stand by it. No diss to Howl, of course, but Bumblebee's charming character is the balance to Emily's more cranky personality, and a lot of amusing moments arise when this contrast is highlighted. That brings me to Emily's character that I honestly found refreshing, and I'm not sure that it gets talked about enough in the book reviews. She is the main character, but her character resembles more like a side character. She would very much like to stay on the sidelines. She is more like an anti-heroine, where all she cares about is doing excellent research and advancing the scientific knowledge on Fae. I found it interesting when she got into a bit of an internal debate about morale, when she couldn't help a child that got bewitched by the Fae, but her rationalization was in line with her character. She was there as academic, not as a savior, promising that she will help the entire village. Her character differs from the usual I will save everyone heroine types, and that, coupled with the light romance subplot and the academic rivals to lovers dynamic, made this book a very enjoyable read for me. The sequel, Emily Wilde's Map of the Other Lands, comes out sometime next year, and I will surely pick that up as well. Next, despite the summer months of June, I stayed with the darker vibes and went for Belladonna by Adeline Grace. My expectations were somehow that this would be on the same level as The Ballad of Never After from Stephanie Garber, but unfortunately this book was a little bit meh for me. In Belladonna, the main plot idea is what intrigued me first. We have Signa as our main character, a 19-year-old girl who was cursed at birth, and it seems like death follows her everywhere, but she herself is unable to die. Later on, she discovers she can see death himself and ghosts as well in certain situations, and that becomes important when she moves to the Hawthorne family estate and suspects that one family member was poisoned instead of dying from illness. I felt like this book tried to be so many things at once. It is a gothic fantasy romance story with some murder mystery sprinkled in it. Plus there was this underlying messaging of Signa's struggles to mold herself to fit the society's expectations, and her character development is basically her choosing her own way instead. While that's an important message at all times, I felt like that could have been left out. Like, it didn't really fit the overall vibe of the story, if that makes sense. Overall, the book does a great job of setting the atmosphere. I imagine the plot happening kind of in the Victorian era, like the way the characters talked and dressed fit into that perfectly. Death as a love interest is surely a darker concept, but I felt like we went very fast into lusting after death, and the fact that he was an immortal entity did not bother Signa too much. That was a bit suspicious for me. Overall, it was an okay read. The murder mystery was predictable, but it kept me engaged. There were a couple points where I felt like big things happened, but somehow no one was concerned. I cannot reveal exactly which points without spoiling the story, but let me know if you have read it and thought the same. So I cannot say I enjoyed it as much as the Once Upon a Broken Heart series, but if a gothic romance with a side of murder mystery sounds like your cup of tea, I'm sure this book will satisfy that craving. The next part, Foxglove, comes out very soon, I think already in September, apparently featuring a supernatural enemy, so I might be convinced to read that too. If you have consumed any book social media content in the last couple of months, you surely have come across the amount of love and hype that Divine Rivals has received. And I'm here to tell you, rightfully so. My mid-year reading wrap-up turned into a bit of an ode to this book and the different angles that I found amazing about it. I truly feel like if someone took all the wishes about characters, plot progression, the balance between devastation and sweet romance from my brain and made it into a book, it would be this one. The wording was so well done to deliver maximum impact, and the storyline between two rival journalists, Iris and Roman. Is this how you're supposed to pronounce it? Do you say Roman or Roman? Anyway, their story had me going through tears, smiles, and my heart feeling full. I cannot wait for the sequel because the story ended on a cliffhanger, and in the meantime I plan to read more from Rebecca Ross, as you will see in this video as well. Okay, but what is this book about? This book is about two rival journalists caught up in the War of Gods. I feel like it's kind of Rebecca Ross's thing to give her characters similar struggles, but have them approach it in completely different ways. For example, in A River Enchanted, that I just finished, both Adara and Jack struggle with belonging and finding their own place, just in a very different way. In Divine Rivals, both Iris and Roman grapple with their obligations towards their families, although these obligations are very different, but they find understanding in each other through that. I think that's a really nice addition, because usually in fantasy romance, the dynamic is rather the opposites attract one, when two characters come together despite them being very different, but Rebecca Ross writes her couples with similar traits, which I enjoy a lot. If you add one book to your TBR from all the ones I talk about in this video, let it be this one, it's so worth it. But please check trigger warnings before, because it deals with heavier topics such as grief and war. But unfortunately, nothing good lasts forever, so after the phenomenal read of Divine Rivals, I picked up Every Summer After next. It also inspired me to make a video. It is the popular books I didn't like one, where I go into more details about this book. But you can kind of see where it's going, right? Let's put it out simply, this book made me feel some rage toward the characters and the way they acted toward each other, and how forgiveness was basically given without them having to work for it, which would have made it much more nuanced in my opinion. In this book we have Percy as our main character, who spent a lot of summers of her childhood in a summer lake house, where Sam and Charlie, two brothers, are her next door neighbors. The book tells the story of Percy's relationship with Sam in two timelines, one during the summers when they were growing up, and one in present time when Percy is invited back for Sam's mother's funeral, now as a 30-year-old adult, after they drifted apart. The dual timeline could have been the saving point, but I felt like both past and present Percy were similarly selfish and there was no character development, which made the timeline idea rather obsolete. Honestly, I do not wish to talk more about this book. If you are curious about my full rant, please check out my previous video about popular books I didn't like. To end this one on a positive note though, the summer atmosphere was really spot on in the background. I enjoyed the summer lake house setting a lot. I was somewhat dejected after that reading experience, so I turned to something quick and read The Sixth Death of the Saint by Alex E. Harrow. I have the 10,000 Doors of January from her as a physical book, but I haven't read it yet, so this was my first experience with any of her works. I read this short story on the train home. The AC was broken, it was like 30 degrees Celsius with scorching sunshine. So at this point I'm not sure if I really experienced the story or if it was some kind of heat-induced fever dream. This was barely 30 pages, but it packed a punch straight to the heart. We enter a sort of time loop story with the narrator speaking from the perspective of a female warrior general and addressing the readers as you while basically talking to herself. A side note, I feel like this kind of you speech makes the story much more immersive and the messaging stronger, at least for me. We witness as the story unfolds over and over again, with the woman becoming a weapon for the prince and serving him, making him king by giving up everything for him. There is a twist and a strong message in the end, but I cannot say more if I wish not to spoil it. It is a super quick read, but it still managed to leave a lasting impression on me, especially with the powerful word choices. So now my copy of the 10,000 Doors of January just jumped ahead on my TBR because I'm curious if it will give a similar feeling. After the short story, I went for something completely different and picked up Clockwork Angel. I think I described it in one of my previous videos that I somehow never picked up Cassandra Clare's books because their Hungarian translation were published a bit later, and at that point I wasn't reading much due to school. But I felt like it was high time that I read Clockwork Angel when I properly have the time for it. I watched the Shadowhunter series back in the day and also the Mortal Instruments movie, so I was somewhat familiar with the world building, and also the nostalgia trick of having like Magnus Bane show up in Clockwork Angel worked on me very well. I enjoyed the immersive setting with London in the 18th century. You can tell that Cassandra Clare studied the time and the customs properly, therefore the main character Tessa reacted very much appropriately in the situations when something strange happened. It was also interesting to see how the author fit the whole Shadowhunter business into this time period, with the rune tattoos and fighting and such. There is no point in describing the plot because the series is so well known, so instead of that I will just share my perspective of reading it for the first time in 2023. Before starting it, I've heard someone describe the series as their favorite of all time, despite the books not being perfect. And I kinda have to agree with the second part. Dare I say, it was a bit boring at times. I know Will and Jem are legendary so-called book boyfriends, but I was sad to discover that in this book at least, they left me underwhelmed. I also know their true magic lies in how their story progresses with Tessa throughout the series as they grow, but after the first book, I don't feel the burning urge to continue the series, to be honest. I have to say, I would have loved this series if I discovered it earlier, during high school for example, because I can tell that the plot contained a lot of elements that would have left me gasping in shock in the 2010s when it came out, but now in 2023, after reading more darker fantasy stories, it wasn't affecting me much. It feels a bit sad, like a door closing in front of me, knowing I will never be able to read these books with the same nostalgia and love as people do who discovered the Shadowhunter world back in their teens, but that is the truth. Jumping from an old fantasy fan favorite to a new one, next I picked up Fourth Wing and made an entire reading vlog about it. I'm not sure I expressed my thoughts clearly there, but basically the more time passes after reading the book, the more I realize this story is just every single YA fantasy cliché back together. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I had a good time reading it, but I didn't need to use too many brain cells to figure out where the story was going, because it was kind of obvious. Let's look at the characters one by one. we have Violet, our main character, and her typical hero's journey. She lived in her ordinary world, preparing to be a scribe. When her call to adventure came, she had to join the Dragon Riders. By the way, we still don't know why her mother basically forced her into something so dangerous. That's never explained. She refused at first and fought against it, but of course she persevered in the college and grew stronger. She encountered tests, allies, and enemies along the way. And she also encountered love interests along the way. One of them was Dane, the childhood best friend who only wanted what is safe for Violet, but with that he prevented Violet from truly growing into her capabilities. On the other hand, we have the dark, mysterious, and untouchable Xaden, from whom Violet is warned to stay away, but of course she doesn't. And of course, Xaden eventually warms up to her. We all know where this will go, right? The story is definitely character focused. Don't think too much about the world building, because there are a few plot holes if you do. Like, the whole war situation is not really fleshed out, something with the dragons protecting their territory, and they need the humans to help with that, despite them being powerful. The Dragon Rider education is literally deadly and cutthroat, but people still volunteer for glory. If there is truly a war situation, why would they kill off a high percentage of the youth population through these college trials? Yeah, the fantasy backdrop is a little vague, but it does its job to elevate the stakes and make the readers root for Violet and her friends during the trials. And once the dragons make an appearance, as I mentioned in the reading vlog, the enjoyment of the story just got like 30% higher. Hopefully, we will see more of their personality and quirks in the next book, Iron Flame, which will be out in November this year. Overall, story-wise and character-wise, The Fourth Wing is nothing that you haven't seen before, but it is an enjoyable read for the fans of dragons and fantasy romance. The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida was our summer book club pick for our local Viennese book club, along with Bunny from Mona Evad. I cannot say it's a book I would have picked up myself, but the first line of the blurb hooked me instantly. It reads, Maali Almeida, war photographer, gambler, and closet gay, has woken up dead in what seems to be like a celestial visa office. And this is basically how the book starts. Maali Almeida was a war photographer, but he is now dead, comes back as a ghost, and he has 7 moons to tie up the loose ends of his life before he is forced to forget about everything. In the description, they mention authors like Gogol, Bulgakov, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, all connected to magical realism and surrealism, and I've read their works back when I was in high school and I was reading much more classics. So I was eager to dive in, chasing the feeling I remembered reading these authors. I have to say I enjoyed the setting of the book much more than the actual plotline. It takes place in Sri Lanka during turbulent political times, and unfortunately, as someone who is not very familiar with the country's history, a lot of the times it was hard to follow all the references and side comments about the power struggles and war happenings. I was personally much more interested in Maali Almeida as a character and his satirical comments about life. This book is also using youth speech, which again makes the messages land much more strongly in my opinion. Here are a few of my favorite lines that had me sitting in silence for a while and just thinking about them. The ending left me a bit dissatisfied, but in the grand scheme of things it makes sense. I just felt like the first half of the book was stronger and the second half dragged a little bit, with the ending making me rather confused. There were details that I thought would be important later on, but then they were just kind of jumped over. So it was definitely a step outside of my current comfort zone with the historical fiction and the magical realism genres, but I am low-key proud of myself that I finished The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida. After venturing into different genres, I went back to my true and trusted fantasy romance and read Dreams Lie Beneath by Rebecca Ross, who is also the author of Divine Rivals. This one is her standalone fantasy story, which I feel like is rare these days. Most fantasy stories stretch the plot to 2, 3 or even more books, but for finishing a plotline in less than 500 pages, Rebecca Ross has my respect. I bet the question burning in your mind currently is this one: is it as amazing as Divine Rivals? Unfortunately, the answer has to be not really, but the book is not without its own merits. The ambience of the story very much reminded me of Once Upon a Broken Heart and Sorcery of Thorns, which you know are two of my favorites, so I had a good time with it. If I have to make a distinction though, I would say Dreams Lie Beneath is a bit more darker and unfortunately less focused on the romantic relationship. It is a surprisingly fast read. The book carries you through the story basically. We have Clementine as our main character, an apprentice magician and warden, alongside her father in their small town. Their duty is to protect the residents from the effects of a curse, namely every new moon the nightmares of the residents come true, and it's on the wardens to break through them basically. Clementine and her father are challenged to a duel by two brothers attempting to grab the position from them, and they are unwillingly drawn into the larger conflict regarding the nightmare curse origin, which might have to do a lot more with Clementine's family than she originally thought. If you expect the same heart-squeezing romance that you experienced in Divine Rivals, here it gets a lot less weight and it's really just a subplot. You have some sweet moments with Rebecca Ross's usual banter, but I also felt like the characters had less depth to them, so the moments felt a lot less impactful in my opinion. Especially for the love interest, we didn't really get the same look into his aspirations, dreams, and general personality as we did for Roman in Divine Rivals, which was a shame. One other thing I want to mention is the writing of the action scenes. It was a bit clunky. It was a bit like, this happened, and then that happened, which made it not the smoothest and most immersive experience to read those parts. On the other hand, it clearly shows that Rebecca Ross worked on improving her writing style for her later works. Overall, it was a solid fantasy read with dark, fairy tale-esque atmosphere, magic, revenge, and some light romance, almost becoming a bit of a mystery story toward the end with the curse. I can definitely recommend it for fans of Once Upon a Broken Heart, Sorcery of Thorns, and of course for fans of Rebecca Ross. After each fantasy read, I try to turn to something different to avoid reader's fatigue, and this time it was The Housemaid, a psychological thriller. I cannot say that I'm well read in this genre, so it was fun to try it out and it really captivated me. As you could have guessed from the title, we have the housemaid who takes on a new job taking care of the Winchester household, where a beautiful couple reside with their daughter. This is not a spoiler because this is the first scene, but we get to know at the beginning that there is a dead body in the house. I remember ranting to my fiance about it, like, I have no idea who the killer or the body is. At this point, any of the three main characters, the maid, the wife, or the husband, could have done it to any of them, and it would make sense. The writing style was a bit of stream of consciousness, which I found it fit the ambience really well because it made you as the reader agitated as well. The plot really kept you on your toes. I feel like in part 1 you were kind of just swimming along with the story, but part 2 delivered the punchline. Oh my god. I was generally creeped out by it, and I read the story in like 3 days and then just sat on the couch like, what did I just read? Oh my god. Safe to say, I will definitely turn to the author next time I need a psychological thriller to shock me. The last read of my summer was a highly anticipated one, Foul Lady Fortune by Chloe Gong. Did I read it without reading These Violent Delights? Yes. Did Chloe Gong, the author, confirm it on her Instagram that you can do that without being confused? Yes. Was I still a bit overwhelmed at first with all these alliances and web of politics? Also yes. The setting of this book is impeccable. We have Shanghai in the 1930s, where there are opposing ideologies and powers in play, with our main characters Orion and Rosalind being spies, sent to investigate a plot by the Japanese that poses a threat. The catch? They have to pretend to be a married couple to work together. Chef's kiss. Actually, besides Orion and Rosalind, we have two other pairs that we follow, Phoebe, Orion's sister, and Silas, Orion's friend, as well as Celia, Rosalind's sister, and Oliver, Orion's brother. So you can see a lot of things are interconnected, and some of them are double or triple agents, and I felt like sometimes that worked against the enjoyment of the book. I really wanted to love it, but it was hard to get into. The flow was somehow not there, and the scenes seemed a bit jagged and thrown after each other, especially when switching between the main pairs, and I had a hard time keeping up with all the motivations and machinations. I admit I am not one for plot-focused works, so that might be the case why I haven't enjoyed this one as much as I expected it to. The book started out with building Rosalind's character and her own past and current struggles, but then between the 30 to 70% marks of the book, it was just political plotlines moving forward, and it didn't keep me interested, unfortunately. The romance build-up next to all of this just felt a bit hollow for me. We got a love confession, and I just sat there feeling nothing, and you know that's not a good sign for me. The last 50 to 100 pages kind of saved the book, but still, it took unnecessarily long to get to those points. There were some things that got revealed toward the end, and instead of bringing the "oh, this has been in front of me all along" feeling, it felt more like, "oh, I have no idea how that makes sense, but okay." So if you want to pick it up for the romance subplot or you're expecting a character-focused story, I would advise against it. But if you are someone who would love to read about spies and spy networks in a 1930s Shanghai setting with some mystery and supernatural elements, this might be interesting to you. Another aspect, I really enjoyed the little glimpses we got into life in that time period in China. The descriptions of food, scents, and noises on the street and clothing helped me be immersed in that story. I just wish they were more elaborated on. So less political machinations and more dumplings and dance halls. That would have been a better balance for me. Looking back at my summer TBR that I planned, I have to say I did quite well keeping to the plan. The ones that remained on my TBR are The Blonde Identity and Better Than the Movies, which I feel like they will be my mood reads during the upcoming months when I need a break from all the dark fantasy and gothic stories. I'm curious though, what were your favorite summer reads? Share it with me in the comments below and let's start a conversation around them. For my next video, I'm planning to bring you some dark academia recommendations and some autumn book hauls, so stay tuned and see you there. Take care!